Hello and welcome back to the inaugural conference of the Korea Europe Center at Freie Universität Berlin. Today is the last day and we will be holding a panel about economics and civil society. So my name is Gwendolyn Domning and I am a doctoral student at the Institute of Korean Studies. I will be hosting the panel today. So our speaker is already here. So let me greet our speaker first, Professor Dr. Werner Pascha. Hello. I want to introduce to you Professor Pascha to the audience. So Professor Pascha is Chair Professor of East Asian Economic Studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and he is affiliated to the MIRR School of Management. Also, he is affiliated to the Institute of East Asian Studies in East. He has studied economics at Freiburg University in Germany and at Nagoya University in Japan. Over the years, he has been invited to several institutes and universities, including the Academy of Korean Studies, the Institute for International Economic Policy, and Doshisha University. He is part of East Asia Net and the European Research School of Contemporary East Asian Studies. He is also co-editor in chief of the Asia-Europe Journal, and his research interests include the political economy of institutional change in Japan and Korea. Also, he is interested in international economic relations of the regions. Today, his presentation will be about Korea's new northern and southern policy in the context of international connectivity initiatives. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please ask them through the chat function. They will be collected, and I will ask the professor your questions after he ended his presentation. So now that all technicalities have been taken care of, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Domning, for the kind introduction. Before starting, I would like to congratulate the Berlin Institute for Korean Studies and KDI on behalf of this wonderful inauguration. I think the Berlin Institute for Korean Studies over the years has clearly developed into the leading center in Germany on contemporary Korea. So actually our university, we have also invested now and trying to get more seriously into contemporary Korean studies. So it's good because the importance of Korea has grown, but we certainly look to the Berlin Institute as the kind of gold standard in that field. And Korea Development Institute, well, what can I say? I mean, when I started dealing with Korea in the 1980s, it was not so easy as today to find some material. So whenever I came across a paper from KDI, I felt safe because those were the authoritative texts, and KDI as the leading think tank on Korean economic and social policy. So then they started the school, and now it's easier for current generation students to get this kind of knowledge. And for the two of them, the Berlin Institute and KDI, to have joined forces in this center, that's a wonderful idea. Congratulations. Well, today I'm going to talk about international connectivity initiatives, infrastructure initiatives in the field of international economic policy. And the Moon government has been engaged in this with the so-called New Northern Policy and the New Southern Policy. So that will be my topic. And maybe we can start with looking at President Moon Jae-in's New Year's message of 2020. And obviously, he also talked about the economy and its external aspects. So he celebrated that Korea maintained its position as the world's 7th largest exporter. And then after one or two sentences, he turned to this new Southern policy that I will explain soon, and argued that export have grown so much, and he also mentions the new Northern policy with its double-digit increases for 3 years in a row. So he gives it great weight in his address to the fellow citizens of Republic of Korea. Obviously, Corona has hit the world, but we already see that Korea will not be affected as much as initially thought. So currently the estimates are that the negative growth will not be higher than 2%, maybe only -1%. So Korea can definitely solidify its position further. So it's good reason to look at what new Northern and new Southern policies can play a role in this. This goes actually much beyond economics. There are many political aspects to it. So I will focus on the economic aspects, but as you will see soon, I cannot totally disregard politics either. So what I will do is first discuss a little bit from an economic perspective, why is infrastructure so important and going beyond the traditional concern for international trade and international investment. Then obviously I will discuss how Korea goes about it. And I will take a look at how this fits the international landscape, because others like China, the US, also Japan, are also engaged in this field. And I will discuss further options, how to proceed, and in that context also talk about the potential role of the EU and Germany. Okay, let's start. And let's turn back about 10 years. We had the global financial crisis, and we had the issue, well, how can the global economy catch up and retain its momentum? And one idea that was put forward was the idea, well, beyond trade, there is so much need for better infrastructure in the world. And the Asian Development Bank in those days estimated the demand alone for Asia to be in the region of $8 trillion US. So that's quite a lot, right? And they did a 2017 update of those figures and came up with a figure of $23 trillion US demand for 2016 and 13. Well, this sounds in a way eye-watering to business, but what is the problem? The problem is that private investment into infrastructure had seriously declined after the global financial crisis. Well, infrastructure is very risky, you know. Bridges may tumble, there may be legal issues. It's really a risky business. And the role of multilateral support institutions, public finance, could definitely not make up this kind of lack of funds from the private sector. Has this problem become easier? No. Global trade is stagnating, as we know. We are even talking about deglobalization. We realize protectionism, while the need for infrastructure is still there. And McKinsey, for instance, estimated that currently it makes up some 14% of the global economy. Now let's look a little bit more closely why it's so complex, even and difficult, even for governments or multilateral finance to step in. Here's a little bit about the economics behind it. Infrastructure has properties of a public good, as we call it in economics. It's not so easy, it's not totally impossible, but it's not so easy to exclude users from using infrastructure. And if that's the case, nobody really wants to pay for it. Also, to a certain extent, at least, there is a non-rivalry of consumption. So if you use it, if you use a digital line, for instance, someone else can use it as well. up to a certain level, right, when it gets congested. But also that means that nobody really is willing to pay. We all know that. We all try to use the internet for free, right, and are getting angry when we have to pay for it. So this is the basic problem for the private sector, so the state has to step in. Now, for international projects, this is, of course, even more difficult. How do states combine their effort? Often these are huge projects. They are enormously costly. There are legal risks and other risks. Third point I would like to make, there are externalities that do not fall and become relevant for your own region. So if I, as a state, invest in infrastructure elsewhere, or even in my country, there are externalities for others. So why would I be willing as a state to pay for these externalities? Fourth point I would like to make is there are additional factors. I mean, what we have said now is that nobody really wants to invest in infrastructure as one should. But if there are additional political benefits to be had, prestige, influence, agenda setting on the international level, maybe even power, then actors may become active. Now, the final problem is that infrastructure is almost a natural monopoly. If you want to build a road between two states in Central Asia, there can only be one road. You know, the second one will already not be economically viable. So if a state wants to gain political prestige, he has to be first in order to invest, because already the second has no viable business model left. So this becomes a scramble, actually, right? Before, nobody wanted to invest, and now everybody wants to invest and wants to be first. A scramble to step in on favorable conditions, maybe lower the price, which means that the quality may get problematic. So, and in this field now, Korea tries to step in. And since 2017, so very early, the Moon Jae-in government formulated its policies. They also have a peculiar policy about Northeast Asia peace and cooperation, but I will not go into this. This is just, time will not be enough. So, first, the New Northern Policy. What is it actually? The idea is to develop closer links with countries beyond North Korea. So this New Northern Policy is not about North Korea, it's actually going further. And Russia is the main cooperation partners, countries in Central Asia. And if you look what this kind of policy initiative wants to achieve, you realize there are so-called 9 bridges, as it's called. And if you look at the bridges, for instance, railways, ports, the North Polar route through the ice fields, north from Russia to Europe, they are, most of them, related to infrastructure. And indeed, there are already some successes. So already in 2015, for instance, Daewoo won a contract for 15 ice-class LNG, so liquid gas carriers to travel the polar route. And in the context of the New Northern Policy, better relations with Russia, quite recently there has been an announcement of 12 more such carriers to be delivered from Korea. Incidentally, this Northern Policy has an additional advantage. Maybe at some stage North Korea could be included, right? The vision would be, well, you know, we could cooperate with Russia if we have closer connections. Maybe sometime we will have a rail connection from South Korea through North Korea to Russia. Okay, that's the New Northern Policy. Then we have the New Southern Policy, which is meant to do, well, similar things on the southern, in the southern areas, ASEAN countries and India in particular. Now, if you look at the objectives of that policy, you realize that there are 3 P's involved, the people, prosperity, and peace. So prosperity is clearly associated with economics and infrastructure, and so far it's the main issue. I mean, there's very little progress and something to be done on peace. So effectively, it's not so dissimilar to the Northern policy. And here there's also good reason to do something about it. For instance, ASEAN has become, as a group, the #2 trading partner for Korea. Yes, I mean, that's quite amazing. And Korea has also been in the past Vietnam's most important foreign investor. So there are very close connections between Vietnam and Korea. Actually, it's said that before the end of this year, we will have a kind of update of the new Southern policy, 2.0 as it's sometimes called, and it will be very interesting to watch how the Korean government is developing this NSP further. So just one or two words about the character of these kind of policies. One point I would like to make is that the new Northern policy has quite strong historical legacies. So they go back to President Roh Tae-woo's Nordpolitik, as it was known, in the late 1980s. We also have, from the former government of Park Geun-hye, the Eurasia Initiative. And maybe some of you know, I think it was in 2015 that they had this kind of Eurasia Express train arriving from Moscow in Berlin. I mean, it couldn't start in Seoul, unfortunately, for obvious reason, because they couldn't pass North Korea, but some started in Russia, some started in China, and the terminus was Berlin. So maybe you remember that. So we have this kind of legacy of such initiatives, and the Moon government is trying to make a new approach. For the ASEAN linkage, so the Southern policy, well, it's more recent, it's more new. Obviously, I showed you Korea has strong links, but to frame this in a kind of consistent policy, this is a rather new development that we can ascribe to the Moon government. Why does Korea do this and try to get engaged? Well, I think there are three terms that are important: autonomy, hedging, and diversification. First, as we are going to see soon, the big shots like US, China have already also been involved. So Korea tries to gain some autonomy by developing its own policy. Second, there is a kind of hedging strategy, because not having a kind of your own peculiar policy easily means that either you lean towards the US only or to China. And well, we know that Korea needs both, the US for security reasons, indispensable. Secondly, such strong economic linkages with China. So one way or another, you have to make sure that you somehow hedge somewhere in the middle. And the third is diversification. So even if we know that Korea has to work with the US and China, well, aren't there possibilities, you know, to develop your own ideas and find new partners? Yes, and the new Southern policy obviously is meant in such a way to kind of upgrade the relations with the important ASEAN countries in order to diversify its relationships. Right, let me very briefly mention what others have been doing. And the first thing to notice is that the kind of dynamics with these kind of infrastructure initiatives definitely started with China's announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. So I think you all know about it. It's meant to be a huge project, and there have been numbers ranging from 1 to 8 trillion US dollars mentioned that China wants to spend with various finance mechanisms, including a new multilateral bank. They started the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. As we also know, the experiences with this kind of initiative are a little bit mixed. So there is slower progress than expected originally. There are also some tensions. On the one hand, I think it's quite clear that the Chinese government wants to raise its status in the global political and economic field, wants to raise its influence, wants to create economic benefits also for its backward regions in Central Asia, but also wants to help others. And there are obvious tensions. There are fears that countries will default on their debts they have with China. And China has recently actually argued that it wants to learn from these early experiences. It wants a more multilateral, less asymmetric, more green and clean, more sustainable approach. But we have to see whether that really materializes. So far, many countries are still skeptical, and I would just refer to the concerns very close to our region here, also in Europe, where there are continuous security concerns and concerns about broken promises. Obviously, the US government is against it, and it would be very difficult for Korea, even if it wished to follow it. And there's quite a lot of uneasiness in Korea, also among the public, with respect to going much further in terms of this engagement. Well, then there is the second major initiative, which is the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which emerged as a catchword around 2016-17. And so I gave you 1, 2, 3 hints for the contents. It's actually a rather vague concept. This is my own interpretation. Number one, this is about freedoms, right? Rule of law, free trade, but also freedom of navigation, which obviously relates to the South China Seas. Second, there is the idea of economic prosperity and connectivity infrastructure. Okay, we already know about that. And third, there is also the idea of peace and stability, enforcement of maritime law, but also non-traditional security risks like terrorism and health. Now, the main partners in this are the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And we might say that the US and Japan are leading, US more noteworthy, but actually only in 2017, shortly after Trump became president. But Prime Minister Abe in Japan already in 2016. Now, this already points a little bit that there are actually different versions of this. And Dr. Wacker 2 days ago already spoke about this a little. There are actually different terms. The US concept is rather close to issues of military security. And here we have another term which is usually used in this military context. It's the Quad. Thinking about a regional security strategy, almost inspired by NATO. This is clearly against China. And obviously, if we think about Korea, getting involved there one way or another, this is certainly something that Korea wouldn't want to do. Even Japan has said that it wouldn't really want to get into such a kind of security strategy, and Prime Minister Suga, the new Prime Minister, has recently said something like that. So the Japanese concept is much more into economic aspects. They are focusing on quality infrastructure and see free and open Indo-Pacific as a way to promote this kind of idea. Now, to make it more complicated, there is something which is called Quad Plus. It's actually a private initiative. Some would call it a Track 2 initiative to develop ideas like non-traditional security, like health issues, and so on. So it's quite different from Quad. And this is another mechanism to participate. Finally, I would like to point out that free and open Indo-Pacific gains weight. It's not only the 4 countries, but it's others who make kind of positive statements about it. And this has very much to do with the language you use in certain contexts. Maybe you have realized that the term Indo-Pacific comes up ever more often recently. Before, we often spoke about Asia-Pacific. Now, many people talk about Indo-Pacific. And actually, ASEAN has made a study announcement which is called the Outlook on the Indo-Pacific in 2019. So this is a signal. France did something with a strategy in 2019 for an inclusive Indo-Pacific, and also Germany has developed this year a new policy guidelines, so-called Leitlinien on the Indo-Pacific region. So very shortly, well, Northeast Asia would be a third opportunity, to create something, and something has happened. For instance, a few people know that since 2011, we actually have a trilateral cooperation secretariat in Seoul that is run by the 3 countries of South Korea, obviously, but then also China and Japan. But it's making little progress. And obviously, in recent days, as you have probably seen from the news, there was supposed to be the yearly trilateral summit between the 3 countries, but currently it seems that it will not come about because of political tensions between Japan and Korea, which you have probably followed in the news. So, if that's the situation, let's try to evaluate it a little. And I'm happy to discuss it with you afterwards. I mean, I already told you that the Korean government itself tries to develop a new NSP 2.0 in the future. And let's speculate a little bit ourselves what Korea might be doing and where are the pros and cons. So the first possibility would be to continue hedging, find a way between US and China. So go on as the Moon government started in 2017. So the biggest pro is obviously that you realize the benefits from a hopefully amiable relationship with US and China because you don't offend them. Plus, you have additional partners like Russia, India, ASEAN, and possibly also Japan. However, there are problems with this kind of strategy. The first problem is that it's very challenging, for the diplomats. I think they have a very hard time. It's also difficult for businesses, who want to find appropriate strategy. Do they really hit the right note? And there was an issue, for instance, last year when the new South Korean ambassador to China made his greetings in Beijing, and Chinese observers reported that he had allegedly voiced support for the Belt and Road, for the Chinese concept of the Silk Road. And South Korean sources and the government sources said immediately, no, he didn't say that. But I think it shows how difficult it is. Second aspect is, well, if you do hedging and if you try to stay, even with respect to all partners, well, you risk losing influence with them, right? You see, well, autonomy also means you have less influence on the great powers. And some people even are talking, that you may isolate yourself, whereas the big shots, move ahead with their infrastructure policies and beyond. I will want to give you an example of this as well. There is something which is called the Blue Dot Network. And this is a cooperation that comes out of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And here the US, Japan, and Australia, so here India is not part of it, have started in 2019 to develop a kind of structure to provide standards for international infrastructure projects, for instance, also in the digital field. And this is based on some consensus in G20 and G7 and so on, but it's the three who will do it. And Korea, despite its strong interest and also importance, for instance, in the digital field, will be a taker of these kind of standards and not part of it. At least for the time being. We will see how the Blue Dot Network develops. So there's a second option, and a second option would be to, well, rather turn a little bit more closely either to FOIP, to the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or to Belt and Road. Well, I think in terms of Belt and Road, it's quite obvious that this is not a very serious policy proposition, also for domestic political reasons within the Republic of Korea. But let's discuss the idea of leaning towards Free and Open Indo-Pacific a little bit more closely. So how can we do it? Or how can Korea do it? Well, you know, it would be to do it like some others and use a language more assertively, like Indo-Pacific and free, also stressing inclusive, that it's not meant to be against others. And there are possibilities like cooperating in the Quad Plus format, something actually Korea is already doing and participating in some conference. But definitely stay away from, you know, security, military issues, like the idea of the Quad I was talking about. So the benefit obviously would be to be recognized as a major partner in a wider free and open Indo-Pacific network without alienating others. And that's something that Korea simply cannot do. For instance, let me just mention that one aspect of the Chinese initiatives is to develop the digital Silk Road project more intensively. Huawei obviously plays a major role in this, and linkages between Korea and China on digital matters are so important that Korea cannot risk being cut off from this, in my humble view. The negative points about this kind of leaning policy is that it's still a kind of diplomatic tightrope. Yes, that's true. And it's also that the strategic or not autonomy is a little bit constrained. Yes, that's also true. If you lean towards it, you cannot be so autonomous. On the other hand, you know, there are also concerns. Let's talk about ASEAN, the new Southern policy. Does Korea really have the power, you know, to make such a strong claim on ASEAN Korea relations? Well, there are the others as well. There is the US, there is China, there is Japan. They all want to get engaged with Southeast Asia. Prime Minister Suga has made his first travels into the region. So maybe we are a little bit over optimistic when we say Korea can be autonomous anyway. Okay, the final idea before I stop would be a third version of how to develop Korea's policies further, and that would be establishing closer links with Europe, with the EU, and maybe hopefully also with Germany. And again, Dr. Wacker spoke a little bit about it. Is there a chance to do that? Yes, there is. Actually, the EU in 2018 introduced its own initiative. It's called Connecting Europe and Asia, Building Blocks for an EU Strategy. And based on this, actually, one such partnership on infrastructure was already inaugurated, namely with Japan in 2019, which was Europe's first agreement based on the 2018 strategy. And that could be something with Korea as well. And a kind of legal basis would be the framework agreement of 2014 between Korea, EU, and its member countries. So this gives us an option. The advantages would definitely be, and I'll look at it a little bit now from the Korean side, to indeed diversify further and to also find partners in Europe with a like-minded approach to multilateral cooperation, also for a certain sympathy for the North Korean issue. So let me also mention the lecture by Professor Kim Yong-mi 2 days ago, who spoke about these kind of possibilities. Obviously, currently we have the sanctioning regime against North Korea, but if we try to think beyond, and let's hope that the climate gets a little bit better in the future, then it would be very helpful for Korea to have a like-minded partner with some sympathy for engaging North Korea, and to have a partner to do this with kind of infrastructure ideas. Well, the negative points are that it's, yes, I think it would be useful, but it's not really essential. You know, frankly speaking, I mean, I always try to praise EU-Korea economic linkages, and I think we all do. But frankly, it's not such an essential partner. In President Moon's New Year message in the context of this kind of economic linkages, Europe was not mentioned. And in many documents you read about Korea and free and open Indo-Pacific, Europe is not mentioned at all. So it's not really so essential. And it's so from that perspective, it's not so easy to find common projects. Even, I told you, there's already an agreement with Japan and EU, and even there it's difficult. Actually, yesterday in Duisburg, we had our own conference on EU-Japan economic and strategic partnership. And one of, it was discussed during the panel that it's quite difficult to make progress on this connectivity partnership between EU and Japan, and it's still difficult to find a kind of a lighthouse project. So it will not be easier, I believe, for Republic of Korea and Europe. And the second negative aspect, of course, is that Europe does not play a role in regional security matters at all. But you may see that as an advantage as well, because in that respect, Europe is a kind of disinterested, a little bit, maybe too strong wording, a disinterested partner, and Korea can find its security strategy elsewhere. Well, these are the points I wanted to make. Here are my conclusions, and I'm happy to discuss with you now for the remaining minutes. Thank you very much for your attention already at this stage.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, Professor Pascha. We will now open the Q&A session. So please, dear audience, send in your questions through the chat function. We will collect them and I can read them out for you. To give our audience some time to think, I prepared a set of questions already for you, Professor Pascha. So my first question is, how stable are the new northern policies for Korea? So, or in other words, how will it fare after President Moon and after the presidential election in 2022?
Well, I think it's stable, and because this is not a kind of policy idea that comes out of the blue, but as I have shown, there is really this kind of international dynamics which is taking place, and one way or another, Korea has to relate to it. And the issue of infrastructure with 14% of global GDP and the problems of achieving economic growth through traditional trade and investment will not go away. And indeed, we already saw or already see that there is a certain continuity between the governments, and earlier governments and the current governments, and this will continue. Well, whether it will be called with the name of New Northern Policy and New Southern Policy, that's a different matter. And I think we know this, that each new government, with a new president, frequently creates its own terms for policy initiatives. But there is a large degree of continuity and some changes which are always necessary. So we know that that this always happens in Korea, but this is not a big problem. So if you look beyond the words, yes, I see the continuity.
We have two questions. The first question comes from Benedict Starr. So he is asking, China has shown its capability to pressure the South Korean economy before. For example, when the government in Beijing influenced Chinese travel agencies to, for all intents and purposes, stop travel to Jeju Island as a sort of retaliation against purportedly South Korean anti-Chinese politics. Where do you think are other vulnerable sectors of the South Korean economy beyond tourism? Could closer ties to the EU or other countries be a means of protection against such a policy in the future? Or are the economic connections to and from China too strong?
Yeah, that's a very smart question. Thank you very much, and it's very relevant. So, I mean, just maybe turning to the issues we are discussing today, where's the danger from China? I think the biggest issue is really the digital infrastructure, because China is so strong. And Huawei is the best example. I mean, even in the US and in Europe, there are concerns. If we engage with Huawei, with China on this kind of digital infrastructure, what may happen? And here I'm sitting in Duisburg, and Huawei and Duisburg have signed an agreement on developing digital infrastructure for the city government, collecting all the data. And there are political discussions here on this very local level, whether that's a really good idea or whether it's dangerous. So this is something that has really be taken into consideration. Now, how can we, or how can the Republic of Korea make sure that something like this doesn't happen? Well, I think there is no entirely satisfactory strategy. And this is why the Korean government, I think, wisely said, okay, we do some hedging, we try to make sure that we cooperate, but that we do not get too dependent, and we diversify our partners, right? This is in economics and business, this is what you do in such situation if you have this kind of lumped risk, right? You are dependent on one big party, and what do? You try to diversify. It's called portfolio diversification in business and economics, and that's also what countries will try to do. It's not perfect, but it's definitely the method of choice in such circumstances.
Yes, thank you for this answer. I hope your question has been answered. So if there are any follow-up questions, please chat them through the chat function. The second question I received is by So-Young Cho. And she is, first of all, thanking you for this interesting presentation and asking you, in your discussions, it looks that the option of hedging or leaning between FOIP and BRI are politically challenging. Also, the idea of linking with Europe has not yet well developed or is not essential, as you put it. Besides political or security challenges, I wonder if there are already estimation or potential economic gains that South Korea can achieve through each of the three options, especially taking into account Korea's digital and knowledge economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it's very difficult to try to calculate the costs and benefits and give kind of economic estimation, so and so $1 million or one of additional trade. At least I have not seen a paper or any kind of study that is doing it that way. So usually it's this kind of qualitative approach that I have also been doing. That is what you find in the papers. Obviously, you can do it in a more refined way, and as the Korean government is currently redeveloping its new southern policy and tries to give it maybe some additional hints in this direction or the others, I'm sure they have more refined studies than I'm currently doing. But I don't think there is a kind of quantitative estimation of those effects. I don't think that's available.
Thank you. So for now, we don't have any new questions, so it's my time to shine. I would like to ask you if international infrastructure, as you said, is the new promising field for economic growth. Who can participate and how restrictive and open is the market? Are there any, you already pointed out with China, there are power dynamics. So what does this imply for economic growth? Will the economic growth be balanced to all the countries participating? And what factors are the most important for the distribution of this economic growth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I mean, infrastructure investment, basically it's open. It's an open market. But it's a market which has its own characteristics. And actually, I just this year published a paper on these kind of economic properties of infrastructure, which makes it so difficult. So the first point, I also try to hint at it, is that you need a lot of finance. So let's say if a global south country in Africa would argue, well, I do an infrastructure initiative on my own, well, where would it get that kind of level of finance? That's almost impossible. I mean, even in Asia, it's not so easy to find appropriate finance. So China has come up with these kind of huge plans. And there was this kind of maybe naive optimism that China, is growing so much and is saving so much so it can finance everything. No, we now realize it's actually not the case. I mean, there are domestic concerns. There are also domestic concerns in China. Arguing, well, our government shouldn't throw the money away and give it to others. There are so many domestic investment needs. And China recently doesn't have such a strong positive trade balance anymore, so cannot really go into it. But also from this perspective, there are not so many additional savings anymore. So even for a big country like China, or also Japan, which doesn't have so much money, there are budget constraints. So even for Japan, it's a problem to raise enough money. So if there are these kind of initiatives and projects, well, only, or let's put it like this, the major countries have a competitive advantage. Even their money funds are limited, but they have a better opportunity to participate. Nevertheless, I should say, basically it's an open market. And there is this development which is called quality infrastructure, right? To make sure that given the finance constraints and given also the risks of building bridges and railroads that don't work anymore after a few years, there should be a standardization of quality. And only if projects follow that kind of quality, they can get access to funds from multilateral banks and so on. So this kind of standard setting, I think, is very much in favor also of smaller partners who get the kind of assured security to get involved in such kind of projects without suddenly staying there and the railroad doesn't work anymore, but they still have to pay off the debt.
Thank you once again for this insightful answer. I have received one last question, or maybe I would like to signal the audience that we are close to the end. So if you have any question, please send them in through the chat function right now. I think we have time for one or two questions still. So the new question I received is from Hendrik Johannemann. So he first of all thanks you very much for your insightful lecture. And he's asking, in Germany and Europe, the discourse about sustainable ways to deal with economic policies is growing stronger, for example, in the area of transportation. Do such considerations about sustainability also play a role in South Korea's new Northern and new Southern policies, or in other regional initiatives on infrastructure?
Yes, they certainly do. And I didn't emphasize that, yes, but it's a good point that you raised at this point. Yes, they do play a role. You know, even if a government like Korea's government would think, well, this is not so much our concerns. No government can do it any longer because these kind of sustainability issues are very much ingrained and part of something that are also only discussed in one or two sentences, the G7 agreement, G20 agreement on quality of infrastructure investment. They all mention this kind of sustainability issue. So when the Blue Dot Network, on the basis of these kind of international consensus, also OECD also has guidelines on quality infrastructure. They will definitely also include sustainability issues in this kind of standard setting. And this is something that the Korean approaches are clearly following. And I think there they can also have good impact, for instance, on joint projects in Central Asia, in Russia, also with the ASEAN countries. But even there, also the ASEAN outlook on infrastructure. They have a policy on connectivity since 2015. Also, they are related to sustainability. You know, it's always a question, is it rhetoric? Is it window dressing, you know, cheap words, or is it more? And I think through this development of standardization, this really becomes concrete, because if you don't follow these kind of standards, you will not be able to get finance from multilateral development banks, full stop.
Yes. So since we are coming close to the end, I am now closing the Q&A session. We will not receive any further questions. And thank you for all the questions. So the last question I received is by Bo Hyun Kim. And the person first thanks you for your insightful presentation. And the question is, in order to create further encourage the cooperation between Korea and Europe, I think it is also important to know what interests the EU could gain via the cooperation with Korea. Not only what Korea could gain from a closer relation with the EU. In what field, except for human rights issue in North Korea, of cooperation with Korea, do you think the EU could be interested mostly?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's not easy to answer or easy to give a very clear answer. This is also the reason why this idea of creating a kind of Korean EU infrastructure initiative is not making so much progress. It is being discussed. And this is known that Korean and EU diplomats have been talking about it, but the advantages beyond sending a kind of signal are a little bit difficult to operationalize. For me, something which makes it highly interesting is Korea's strengths in digital infrastructure. And I think there it's very helpful for the EU to develop closer ties. I think this is one of the major comparative disadvantages currently if we talk about platforms, for instance, if we talk about digital standard setting and so on. So it's difficult for the EU to find partners. So one of the attractions of linking up with Korea would be to work much more intensively on such matters, and to make also, of course, that's necessary, make funds available for that, right? It means that if we have such a kind of initiative between Korea and the EU, we need a kind of budget allocation also from EU sources, from Korea sources. We need to find private partners. There are the obvious companies in Korea to link up with, and this is a chance. I don't see this such a kind of connectivity initiative between EU and Korea as the kind of only way for the EU, right? I think the EU would definitely be interested to follow up on its initiative with Japan further, and also obviously to develop even better links, maybe now with a new government in the US, with them and others. So, but it would be one further brick to develop this kind of field in the digital era.
Yes, so it is now exactly 11 a.m. So we are closing the Q&A session and also ending our first presentation. So thank you once again, Professor Pascha, for this interesting lecture and also all these very insightful answers. It's always a pleasure to have an expert opinion on these matters. And I thank everyone for their attendance, but do not forget, after a short break, we will start the second half of the third panel at 11:30. And this time we will have Professor Dr. Ilse Lenz, and she will give us a presentation about gender issues in East Asia. So I'm looking forward to see you once again, dear audience, in WebEx. And Professor Pascha, thank you. Do you have any last words you want to tell the audience?
Well, yes, I would also like to thank you in Berlin, and would like to thank the audience for attending and for the very interesting questions that are raised. And finally, all the best for your joint center between FU Berlin and KDI. All the best.
Great. See you soon.